Happy International Podcast Day. Okay, you may not be listening to this bonus episode on International Podcast Day, but you'll likely still get a lot out of it. In this shortened bonus episode, I'm going to share a few things I've learned about growing an audience and community around an audio podcast. This is Pastoring in the Digital Parish, providing resources and community for those of us engaged in digital ministry, whether as full-time online campus ministers or as part-time solo pastors. My name is Ryan Dunn, and I'm a compulsive podcaster. I love the medium. I'm currently engaged in producing 2 podcasts, this podcast and the Compass podcast. I've done a couple others in the past, and I've spent a lot of time and energy in learning as much as I can about podcasting, from production quality to marketing. Podcasts, to me, are beautiful. They require little in the way of technical investment and offer us always-on access to our constituents, meaning that once we release a podcast, it's always there. Our people, our audience, they can access that content and feel like they are connecting with us by extension all week long. And that's really valuable. But making a podcast isn't the hard part. Actually, getting people to listen to our podcasts is the real challenge. If you build it, they will come. Only works in movies and novels. Nobody can count on that happening in real life. You know that as a person in ministry. And it applies for podcasting. You can't just make a podcast and expect people to listen. There are a bajillion podcasts. Well, actually, it depends on who you ask, but most sources report there being over 2 million podcasts. So even if you have a spot-on title and keyword-packed episode descriptions, there's still a lot of clutter to distract potential listeners as they search for podcasts in our field. The clutter is so dense that producers can really no longer count on listeners finding their podcasts without a fair amount of marketing. Listeners need to be guided to our podcasts. And we can't just build a great podcast and hope people will come and listen to it. There are several ways to bring people to our podcast without shelling out a lot of money. Although, to be honest, I have to admit that paid advertising is probably the most expedient way to build an audience. However, I realize most podcasters start with a budget of like 75 cents, and that all goes towards production. So we'll focus on some cheap alternatives for audience growth. And let's do that by beginning with debunking a couple myths about podcast marketing. The first myth is that ratings and reviews help our shows get noticed. Now, like most myths, there's some partial truth to this. Ratings and reviews may help sell our podcast to potential listeners. So they see a good rating, good reviews, and they want to listen. But ratings and reviews don't actually push our podcasts up the all-important Apple Podcast charts. Now, I say that's the all-important Apple Podcast chart because Apple Podcasts, it's like the Facebook of the podcasting realm. It's by far the most widely used platform. If you're to look at the listeners of your podcast by platform, you're likely to see that Apple Podcasts is the leader in that. Most people are listening on Apple Podcasts. Well, I did a little research. I took a look at the bestsellers in the Christian section of Apple Podcast charts, and it features the best ranked podcasts labeled Christianity. Now, conventional thinking suggests that these are the podcasts with the highest review ratings or the most positive comments, right? But that's actually not the case. Your podcast may actually have more reviews and ratings and episodes than several of the podcasts that were featured on the best sellers list on Apple Podcasts. So when I did this back in August, I found some surprising things about some of these featured bestsellers. One of them had just 2 episodes and 13 reviews. It was in like the top 10. Another one had just 3 episodes and 65 reviews. And then there was yet another that had 23 episodes and 139 reviews. So what do you think? Do ratings and reviews matter? The number of ratings and reviews on this list vary and range from like a dozen-ish to a dozen thousand-ish. Obviously, there's something else driving Apple's rankings. And honestly, they're not disclosing what it is. We can only conjecture a few ideas of what drives this ranking system. It could be total number of subscribers over the past week, or it could be the total number of episode listens across a time span, or it could be total number of next episode listens across a defined time span. Or it could be all these factors combined, and then some extra factors that we're unaware of. It truly seems that Apple Podcasts does not prioritize what people are talking about as it forms its rankings. Instead, it prioritizes what people are actually listening to. So, in order to get more people listening to our podcasts through Apple Podcasts, we need to get more people listening to our podcasts. Sounds a little circular. It's easy, right? Sure. Well, let me be honest. The takeaway with this revelation about Apple's rating system is that we don't really need to prioritize ratings and reviews. If we're going to ask our audience to do something that helps our show grow, there are more effective actions than dropping a rating or review. We need to get our audience talking about our podcasts in other ways. So that leads us into our second myth, and that is that social media drives listenership. Again, this is partially true. Audience engagement drives listenership, and social media can be a great way for engaging with your audience. But so can a good email list. And no one discovers an email list without a good content platform. And no one discovers your podcast on social media without good audience engagement. So you need to already be engaging well on social media in order to get people to listen to your podcast through social media. Therefore, if you're posting your episodes to a ministry Facebook page as a way of marketing your podcast, well, then there's a good chance that no one's finding your posts. If you're somehow using your episodes to start conversations with people on Facebook, then it might gain some traction. Okay, so that's a couple of debunked myths. Now, let's hit what does work, the good stuff, what you came here for. And that is to get people talking about your podcast in a way that actually leads to people listening. Now, despite Apple's devaluing of ratings and reviews, word of mouth is still the key factor in growing an audience. So the best way to grow an audience is to get people talking about your podcast, not in the way of ratings and reviews, but rather sharing your podcast themselves with other people. And the first step to get people talking about your podcast is to make sure that you're offering valuable content. Now, in the religious world, that means that we should be seeking to answer questions people are actually asking about their faith, about our world, and about the divine. If we approach every episode as an opportunity to lead someone towards transformation, then we'll be guided towards offering valuable content. And valuable content gets people talking. Most of us have a practice of adding a call to action into our episodes. For many, that call to action has been to, ask people to subscribe or to offer a review. We probably want to change what our call to action is, emphasizing something that readily leads towards audience growth. So a valuable call to action might be something like, hey, if this episode was valuable to you, then do me a favor and post, hey, I just learned blank while listening to the blank podcast. You can feel free to fill in the blanks for your audience member. Other effective calls to action would be to join a Facebook group, a great way to engage with and interact with people, or to join an email list, both ways of building audience interaction, or again, to listen to the next episode, because as we've seen, Apple prioritizes actual listens. A good practice is to be concise and clear on your call to action, however. So it's best to just choose one call to action and stick with it. Then we're getting to the big audience growth hack, which is to be a guest on somebody else's podcast. Probably the most expedient way to grow an audience is to get featured as a guest on another podcast. This exposes you to an audience who is already engaged in listening to podcasts. And if it's related to your topic, then we know that they share like interests, and they're likely going to want to hear more from you. So here's a simple formula for offering yourself to other podcasts. First, start by trolling Apple for podcasts related to yours. Or, just hit up your friends who are likely doing similar podcasts. Then reach out to the producer or host explaining why you love their podcast and what value you can offer to their listener. And then show your own review of their podcast. Again, that restates why you value their podcast. Then offer to share the episode featuring you across your platforms, including your own podcast's RSS feed, and be clear what you would like to speak with them about. Now, really, appearing on another podcast is getting someone else to talk about your podcast, which is what we're trying to do, right? We've learned that's really the best way to grow an audience. Just be aware that when you're on someone else's podcast, you're there to offer their audience value regarding the theme of that podcast. So this is not simply an opportunity to talk about why people should listen to your podcast. Podcasting offers a great way to inspire community. And it seems that the real way to build a podcast audience is to nurture community around your podcast or podcast topic. If you want to see this in action, I'm going to invite you to join the Pastoring in the Digital Parish Facebook group, where we attempt to build community around this podcast, Pastoring in the Digital Parish. Now, I hope that this bonus episode was super helpful in its own way. I'll be back with a regular episode in a few days. In the meantime, hey, happy International Podcast Day.